When we think about a life sentence, we think of criminals having to spend their last moments in prison. However, that's not necessarily the case. Here are some criminals who outlived their time between the four walls and had to re-enter a life vastly different from the one that they had been so accustomed to. Number 1. Joseph Ligon. Widely known as America's longest prisoner who was convicted to a life sentence as a minor, Joe Ligon was sadly convicted of a crime at just 15 years old. On February 20th of 1953 in Philadelphia, Ligon just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was with a group of teenagers who committed a string of robberies to buy alcohol, which led to multiple people being unalived. It was argued that his case had certain flaws from the start, as Ligon was not allowed any legal representation nor any family visits despite being a minor. The police also gave them confessions to sign. Although Ligon did not end anyone's life, he and other defendants were convicted of first degree and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ligon had spent a long time fighting his case alongside his attorney of 15 years, Bradley Bridge, who said that if this case went to trial today, Ligon would have only gotten a sentence of 5 to 10 years, which highlights how flawed the legal system was. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled all juvenile lifers to be resentenced under Miller v. Alabama. The following year, Ligon was resentenced to 35 years, meaning he could apply for parole due to time served. However, he refused to accept parole, as he wanted to have full control over his case, and so he continued to serve out his sentence. Ligon spent nearly 7 decades in prison, entering at 15 and re-entering a world that he barely recognized at 83 years old on February 11th of 2021. When CBS News' Michelle Miller asked what the first thing he did as a free man was, he replied, "I broke down with a big smile on my face. A free man, free at last." Number 2. Charles Edrit Ford. Charles Edrit Ford's conviction was one of the many unfortunate cases of wrongful conviction and racial profiling. He was initially sentenced to life in prison for first degree in 1952, despite not being at the scene of the crime. Later in 1975, he was charged again with second-degree assault while out of prison for a leave of absence. The victim of the crime said that she had observed a man standing by a red Ford Pinto, a car that was registered as a rental under Ford's name. However, Ford was not responsible for committing these acts of which he was accused. In both the 1952 and 1975 trials, the entire jury was white, as was the judge. During the trial, there was also little evidence presented to suggest that he was guilty, and he was not even allowed to bring in any witnesses to testify that he was, in fact, not at the scene. The 1952 conviction was only reopened in 2016 when Judge Helen Harrington discovered that Ford's lawyer failed to file an appeal to review his sentence, and also found that the judge on the case failed to inform Ford of his post-trial rights. This allowed Judge Harrington to throw out the case. As for the 1975 conviction, Judge West sentenced Ford to 5 years and 2 years of unsupervised probation. When the sentence was given, Ford began to cry openly in the courtroom. He finally got the freedom he deserved. Ford spent a total of 64 years in prison, entering prison at 19 years old before finally being released on March 23rd of 2016 at 84 years old. The real suspect, Jake Robinson, eventually confessed, and a court review found no evidence to show Ford had anything to do with the crimes. Unfortunately, shortly after Ford's release, he learned that he had an aggressive form of lung cancer. Although he was finally free, he spent the last few months of his life surviving off charity and donations, which covered his funeral, as he never received any compensation for his wrongful conviction, and 3 decades on condemned row. You hear stories like this and you realize how insane people sound when they don't think racism is still real. Number 3. Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby. Not only did Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby outlive his prison sentence, he even voluntarily returned to prison after serving out his sentence. Johnson was sentenced to life imprisonment after ending a man's life in a bar when they were having a drink and got into a fight. Despite being a model prisoner who kept to himself, he was denied parole 33 times before being finally released. He was finally released in 1974 after 66 long years. He was already 89 years old at the time of his release. Naturally, this meant that it was a big adjustment for him in a society that he had not been a part of for nearly 7 decades. Unable to cope with such a drastic change and finding a job, he voluntarily returned to prison, where he remained for 17 more months before he was again released. He was 91 at the time of his second release. He stayed at the Marion County Healthcare Center, where he found comfort in the routines that were set, much like the prison life that he was so used to. Grisby later passed in 1987 at 101 years old. Number 4. Richard Honeck. Richard Honeck was just 20 years old when he was arrested in Chicago in September of 1899. He and another friend, Herman Hund Haasen, unalived a former schoolteacher, Walter Kohler. The two men wanted revenge against Kohler, as he had previously testified in a prosecution that Honeck and Hund Haasen were charged with, for setting a number of fires in their hometown of Herman, Missouri. Honeck had a mostly clean record in prison, besides a previous assault on a warden during his first year at Gillette Prison. He was then moved to Southern Illinois Penitentiary, where he worked for 35 years in the prison bakery. After spending 64 years in prison, Honeck was released on the 20th of December of 1963, upon the intervention of his niece, Clara Orth. According to a 1963 Chicago Tribune article, whilst being escorted on a flight to San Francisco, Honeck was visibly amazed at the progress that had passed him by while he sat behind prison bars. Which is to be expected given the extreme length of his prison sentence. His niece, Orth, had to quit her job to care for her uncle, selling her one-bedroom trailer home and buying another in Oregon, which had 2 bedrooms for him. Because of his deteriorating condition, Honeck eventually had to be admitted to Roseburg Nursing Home in 1971, where he spent the last 5 years of his life. He passed away on December 1976 at 97 years old. Richard Honeck was the first prisoner to attract widespread media attention simply because of the length of time that he'd served. Despite his outrageously long prison sentence, his record has since been exceeded by many other cases. Number 5. Francis Smith. From a young age, Francis Smith had a string of run-ins with the law. He ended up at the Cheshire Reformatory for male youths at just 13 years old. After assaulting a guard and escaping, he found himself moving to a maximum security prison. As he grew older, Smith became a part of a crew that committed petty crimes all over southern Connecticut. However, things changed in 1949. Smith was incarcerated for his part in the unaliving of a night watchman in Greenwich. He was 24 at the time. During his lengthy prison sentence, he managed to escape once from a prison farm in Enfield in 1967, causing a huge manhunt for 12 days. He was also on parole for 10 months before landing himself back in prison in 1975. On June 7th of 1954, the day of Smith's scheduled execution, the lead investigator in the case, Leo Carroll, announced that he had been wrong. In a last-minute hearing, Carroll testified that it was not known whether Smith was actually at the scene of the crime, and Smith's sentence was modified just 2 hours before his trip to the chair. Another breakthrough in Smith's case happened when the key witnesses in the crime admitted they lied. To escape the death penalty, George Loudon agreed to testify that Smith was the second shooter, but later retracted his story on the witness stand and claimed that the police forced him to lie. This breakthrough allowed Smith to be released from prison in September of 2020, after 71 years at the age of 96. Smith is currently living in a nursing home near Hartford, Connecticut. Number 6. Paul Gaydell Jr. Also from Connecticut, Paul Gaydell had a rough start to life. He was orphaned at just 7 years old, dropping out of school at the age of 14. He wasn't suited for manual labor, so he worked as a bellhop in Hartford and New York. On July 26 of 1911, Gaydell targeted one of the guests staying in the Iroquois Hotel, as he was supposedly a wealthy broker, and so Gaydell sneaked into William Jackson's room and unalived him. He made away with just enough money to buy a suit. 2 days later, Gaydell was arrested and ended up being convicted of second degree and sent to prison for 20 years to life. Gaydell was sent to Sing Sing Correctional Facility in New York. Gaydell had a breakdown in prison in 1919, his 8th year in. He was sent to the lunacy ward in Dannemora, where he spent 7 years before he was transferred back to the general prison population. His final location would be in a unit designed for elderly inmates that more resembled a dormitory rather than a prison at Fishkill Correctional Facility. Gaydell was granted parole in August of 1974, but the now 80-year-old didn't want to leave. Perhaps it was because he'd already been in prison for 63 years. It was the only life he knew. He chose to remain in prison for almost 6 more years. On May 7th of 1980, Gaydell left Fishkill, having served the longest prison sentence in American history, and even making it into the Guinness Book of World Records. He spent the rest of his days in a Dutchess County nursing home until the age of 93 years old. Number 7. John Phillips. In 1952, John Phillips was convicted of sexually assaulting a 5-year-old girl in North Carolina. He was 18 years old and in the 9th grade, so he was sent to be evaluated at the State Mental Hospital for Black people. The report states that Phillips had the mind of a child aged 7 years and 7 months. His lawyer entered a guilty plea to avoid execution, but the judge sentenced him to life. Though he pleaded guilty, he has since maintained his innocence. The loss of medical and court records makes it difficult to prove his innocence, but studies of exonerations reveal that intellectually disabled defendants are especially likely to make false confessions. Phillips was sent to the state penitentiary in Raleigh. Over the decades, he was moved around, spending much of his time in minimum security prison camps. He arrived at Durham Correctional Center in 1989. Over the years, he lost the will to leave prison as he took much comfort in the routines of prison life. In 1991, the Durham newspaper wrote about his status as the state's longest-serving inmate. The article was discovered by his remaining family and allowed them to be reunited. After the release of the article, top prison officials came to the Durham prison. They feared a lawsuit and wanted to release him, but Phillips did not want to leave. According to the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, he was released on parole on March 9th of 2021, spending a total of 68 years in prison. His parole date ends on March 8th, 2026. Number 8. Howard Christensen. On May 21st of 1937, Howard Christensen and an accomplice had admitted to robbing and shooting a 26-year-old schoolteacher named Ada Carey in Oneida, South Dakota. Their motive? To steal $10 and her car. Christensen was 16 at the time, and Norman Westberg, 17, were in the guise of hitchhikers and picked up by Carey. Before she passed, she was able to give a description of the boys, which led to their arrest and life in prison. Christensen was described as slightly demented and had spent many years in jail and psychiatric hospitals. Around 30 of those at the Yankton State Mental Facility. He had a long history of being obnoxious to his visitors and fellow inmates, according to a prison spokesman at the South Dakota State Penitentiary, where Christensen received 9 courses of electric shock treatment and was kept on the psychiatric ward. Christensen's sentence of life without the possibility of parole was reviewed midway through the 1970s before finally being paroled by Governor Bill Janklow in June of 2001 on the grounds of health after spending 64 years in prison. He passed away in 2003 at the age of 82. Number 9. Clifford Hampton. In 1958, 17-year-old Clifford Hampton took the life of his childhood friend, 18-year-old Bertha Ann Gibson, after she refused to have sex with him. In an uncontrollable fit of rage, Clifford attacked her 28 times with a sharp weapon. After he realized what he did, he turned himself in. Although a juvenile, he was tried as an adult in court and thus was sentenced to life in prison. He was placed in the Louisiana State Penitentiary, more commonly known as Angola. In his 3rd year at Angola, Clifford took another life, a fellow inmate, because he heard that they had been spreading lies about him, which led to his 2nd life sentence. The Montgomery versus Louisiana decision created a release opportunity through parole for Hampton, along with 255 other juvenile lifers in the Louisiana State prison system. Hampton was 78 years old when he was released on parole in 2019. After 61 years behind bars, the Louisiana Board of Pardons and Parole released Hampton from prison for good. The community support that got him his freedom also provided him with housing, clothing, and some monetary resources to help him get back on his feet, and he currently still resides in Louisiana. Number 10. Harvey Stewart. Harvey Stewart had his first conviction in 1951, serving 10 years in a Texas prison for armed robbery. Paroled 6 years later, he returned in 1958 for taking the life of 26-year-old James Leard. Stewart escaped prison in 1965 and was recaptured a few days later. Stewart became eligible for parole after serving 9 years. And finally, in 1985, he was paroled despite whatever objections Jefferson County still had. One might think that this would finally be his shot at freedom, but it was only 16 months before Stewart landed himself back in prison for a bank robbery. His outrageously long sentence came to a close in 2011 after 59 years in prison. His parole was approved due to his recent history of good behavior, age, and declining health. Like Stewart says, he's too damn old to rob anything. Stewart has served his time isolated from the outside world. He also hadn't had a visitor in more than a decade, as he outlived most or all of his immediate family. As of 2014, he was confined by law to a nursing home and still attempting to get his 1958 sentence overturned. When interviewed about his time in prison, Stewart replied, "Imagine that. 60 years down this damn hole. I wouldn't recommend it. Man's got to be a damn fool to even stick his foot in here." Number 11. James R. Moore. Known as New York's longest-serving prison inmate, James Moore pleaded guilty to first-degree and was sentenced to life in prison for the 1962 unaliving of a 14-year-old Penfield girl, Pamela Moss. He also admitted to committing a sexual act on a 9-year-old and 40 or 50 other instances of sexual assault. He pleaded guilty to the 1962 crime in order to avoid condemned row and was sentenced to life without parole. However, changes to state law later made him eligible for parole every 2 years starting in 1982. Moore spent the next decade at Attica Correctional Facility, working as a dental assistant, school teacher, and administrative assistant in the prison. In 1973, he was moved to Auburn Correctional Facility, where he later met and eventually married Joyce Smith, the volunteer coordinator of the prison's arts programming. Moore spent more than 2 decades in Auburn, where he earned several business degrees and worked as a clerk and machinist before being transferred to Collins Correctional Facility in Gowanda in 1999. From there, he was sent to Cayuga Correctional Facility and then Franklin Correctional Facility in Malone. According to Moore, during his time in prison, he learned that chemicals he was using during his time as a landscaper were known to cause episodes of mania, and he came to believe that that's why he committed those crimes. Moore was granted an open release date, which marks his 21st request since the early 1980s. He was scheduled to be released on or around June 6 of 2022 after 60 years in prison. There's little information available as to whether or not he's been released, but it's most likely that if he was placed in full-time care, and he recently had both of his lower legs amputated. Number 12. Chester Weger. In March of 1961, Weger was convicted of unaliving Lillian Oding, one of 3 friends who were at an all-woman weekend getaway at the Starved Rock State Park in LaSalle County, Illinois, in March of 1960. He signed a confession admitting he committed the crime. Weger, however, later recanted the confession as he claimed detectives had threatened him with his life and obtained the confession under duress. At the time of the crime, Weger was a dishwasher in the kitchen at the Starved Rock Lodge. There was some twine found in the kitchen that was similar to the kind of twine used to bind the women. He also failed a lie detector test and was put under constant surveillance. Although Weger constantly maintained his innocence, on March 3rd of 1961, the jury returned a verdict of guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. On November 20th of 2019, the Illinois Prisoner Review Board, in a 9-4 vote, finally granted Weger's request for parole. The past 23 requests had all been denied. At the time of his release, 80-year-old Weger was the second longest-serving Illinois inmate, having served a 61-year sentence. 2 years after his release, on August 1st of 2022, evidence from the Starved Rock case went to the lab. One of the gloves worn by the victim, Francis Murphy, contained a strand of hair. It was a man's hair, and the lab retrieved DNA. However, it wasn't Weger's DNA. While Weger's attorneys, Andy Hale and Celeste Stack, were thrilled at Chester's release from prison, they vowed to continue to fight for his innocence. Number 13. Henry Montgomery. In 1963, 17-year-old Henry Montgomery was accused of shooting a white East Baton Rouge sheriff's deputy. More than 60 black men were arrested in the wake of the shooting, and cross burnings were reported in the days leading up to the trial. Montgomery was tried and convicted for the crime and automatically received condemned row. In 1966, Montgomery was retried on the basis that the atmosphere around the trial had prejudiced him and prevented a fair trial. His sentence was changed to life without parole. Despite being a teenager entering a notoriously violent and abusive Angola prison, Montgomery became a coach and trainer for a boxing team he formed, worked in the prison's silkscreen department, and became a positive role model and counselor for the other men in the prison. In 2012, the Supreme Court held in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole sentences imposed on juveniles are unconstitutional. Montgomery filed a motion to challenge his sentence under Miller, but was denied. Montgomery appealed, and in 2016, the Supreme Court decided, in his case, that all states were required to apply the ban that was announced in Miller. As a result, Montgomery was resentenced to life with the opportunity for parole after the court's decision, but the parole board denied him release in 2018 and 2019. Finally, in 2021, the Board of Pardons and Committee on Parole voted unanimously for his release. Montgomery walked out a free man on November 17th of 2021 after 57 years in prison, at the age of 75 years old. Montgomery's case had such an impact that today, 31 states and the District of Columbia either ban life without parole sentences for children or have no one serving the sentence. Number 14. Gloria Williams. Gloria Williams is Louisiana's longest-serving incarcerated woman. In 1971, 25-year-old Williams was arrested in Louisiana after she and two others tried to rob a grocery store using a toy gun she took from her son. During a struggle with the store's owner, Budge Kutera, Williams' accomplice, a 16-year-old girl, took Kutera's life. 9 months later, all three were sentenced to life without parole. While in prison, Williams transformed her life, participating in the prison ministry and the Big Sisters program, in which long-termers mentor newly arrived women. In July of 2019, Williams appeared before the Louisiana Board of Pardons and Paroles, hoping to be eligible for parole. By then, Williams was the only one still imprisoned. However, it was a long 2-year wait with the governor not taking any action and with the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, on August 20th of 2021, over 2 years after the parole board's recommendation, Williams was finally eligible for parole consideration. On the 25th of January of 2022, Williams appeared via Zoom before the 3 paroled board members who voted unanimously to grant Williams parole if she had no contact with the Kutera family. Hours later, 76-year-old Williams walked out of prison after 51 long years. Williams was reunited with her family, including her siblings, children who are now adults, adult grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Number 15. Sheldry Top. Like many other criminals, Sheldry Top had a difficult start to life, being abused by his father at a young age and constantly being in and out of mental institutions since the age of 12. In 1962, Top took the life of 50-year-old Charles Davis after breaking into his home. At the time, he was 17 years old and on the run from the state mental hospital at Pontiac. Top was captured in Chicago in 1962, less than 2 weeks after. Top confessed to the crime and was sentenced to life without parole in a Michigan county court. His sentence was later lowered to 40 to 60 years, also due to Montgomery versus Louisiana, as he was a juvenile at the time. When Judge James Alexander resentenced Top, he had already served 56 years and had more than 10 years' worth of good behavior credits. This allowed him to be released without a parole hearing, and in February of 2019, Top walked out of prison a free man at 74 years old. He currently stays with family who has supported him throughout his prison term. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.